which was the object of the Jacksonians of the North. The tariff bill would be defeated, and yet Jackson's men in the North would be able to parade as true friends of the tariff. The whole plan blew up in our faces. When Adams' supporters in Congress, to the chagrin of a dazed South, did the utterly unexpected and voted the tariff bill into law on May 28th of 1828, they perceived that the long-term benefits of the bill outweighed the short-term detriments. Adams signed the bill and was promptly trounced by Jackson in the election that November. A month later, in December of 1828, while I was still serving as Adams' vice president, I penned the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. The effect of the tariff of 1828, which raised duties even higher, was even more devastating for the South. The tariff reduced the market for British goods in America, reduced British sales, and therefore reduced profits for British manufacturers. With less money to spend, the British in turn further reduced their imports of southern cotton. The tariff forced the South to buy goods manufactured in the North and inflated prices, while at the same time reducing southern cotton exports and the corresponding revenues. While the North got rich, the South fell deeper into depression. It was against this backdrop that I wrote my exposition of protest. I began my exposition of protest with a main thesis. The Constitution gave Congress power to lay imposts and duties for the purpose of raising revenue, not to plunder the South, and certainly not to redistribute the wealth of the South to the North by way of tariffs. Accordingly, I wrote, the act of Congress of the last session, the tariff of 1828, imposing duties on imports, not for revenue, but for the protection of one branch of industry at the expense of others, is unconstitutional, unequal, oppressive, and calculated to corrupt the public virtue and destroy the liberty of the country. Then, echoing Jefferson and Madison, I reminded my readers that the Constitution gave Congress only enumerated powers, and that any power not specifically granted was reserved to the states. I said, the general government is one of specific powers and can rightly exercise only the powers expressly granted and those that may be necessary and proper to carry them into effect. All other powers are reserved expressly to the states or to the people. I next elaborated on my main thesis that Congress had not been given the taxing power for the purpose of redistributing income. That is, it had not been granted the taxing power for the purpose of enriching the North at the expense of the South. I said it is true that the Constitution authorizes Congress to lay and collect and impose duty, but that is granted as a tax power for the sole purpose of raising revenue. A power of that nature is essentially different from one imposing a protective or prohibitory duties. The Constitution grants to Congress the power of imposing a duty on imports for revenue, which power is abused by being converted into an instrument of rearing out the industry of one section of the country on the ruins of another. I then explained the economic realities of the situation. The duty on imports, which is paid mainly out of our labor, gives them, the northern manufacturing interests, the means of selling to us at higher prices, while we cannot compensate the loss, or dispose of our cotton or other products to the least advantage. We cultivate the great staples for the supply of the general markets of the world. They manufacture almost exclusively for the home market. Their object in the tariff is to keep down foreign competition in order to obtain a monopoly of the domestic market. The effect upon us is to compel us to purchase at higher prices, both what we obtain from them and from others. without receiving a corresponding increase in the price of what we sell. I then recurred to my warnings that the Founding Fathers had given as to the dangers of an unbridled majority. In doing so, I explicated the fatal dangers of income redistribution. If there be a political proposition universally true, is that irresponsible power is inconsistent with liberty, and it must corrupt those who exercise it. If the laws were uniform in their operation, if a law that imposed a burden on one imposed it likewise on all, or one that acted beneficially for one acted beneficially for all, the responsibility of representatives to their constituents would alone be sufficient to guard against abuse and tyranny. But be it supposed that from diversity of interests in the several classes and sections of the country, the laws act differently, so that the same law, though couched in general terms and apparently fair on its face, shall in reality transfer the power and property of one class or section to another, then the responsibility to constituents must prove wholly insufficient to preserve the purity of the public agents and the liberty of the country. The opposing interests of the community would engender hostile parties, organized on this very diversity of interest, the stronger of which, if the government provided no efficient check, would exercise unlimited and unrestrained power over the weaker. Over the period of 12 years, from 1816 to 1828, the South had experienced the adverse effect of the enactment of three separate tariffs, those of 1816, 1824, and 1828. Tariff rates had been increased with each successive enactment, as had the benefits to the manufacturing interests in the North and the detriments to the agricultural interests in the South. My fear, based on 12 years of experience, was that the majority of the more populous North would eventually, by use of the tariff, confiscate and redistribute the entire wealth of the South, thereby enriching the North and changing the nature of the federal union from a union composed of sovereign and equal states to a union of unequal states, in which the Southern minority would become subjects. To conclude, I conclude with my last few remarks. The relation of equality between the parts of the community, established by the Constitution, would be destroyed, and in its place would be substituted the relation of sovereign and subject between the stronger and weaker interest in its most odious and oppressive form. They, the manufacturing interests, feel and act on all questions concerned with the American system as men invariably do who impose burdens upon others for their own benefit. And we, on the other hand, like those upon whom the burdens are imposed. In a word, to the extent stated, the country is divided and organized into two great parties, the one sovereign, the other subject, bearing toward each other all the attributes which must eventually accompany that relation, under whatever form as it may exist. As I conclude my remarks today, imagine an America 150 years ago, from now, say in 2010, where a majority uses its power to take by taxation from a minority whatever it believes it needs. That is why I reiterated what Jefferson and Madison said, and why I formulated my doctrine of nullification.